The text message hit my phone at 3 a.m. and shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. It wasn't just a notification, it was an emergency flare from a world I didn't even know existed. Dad was supposed to be in Chicago closing a massive deal, a trip he took every 3 months like clockwork. But the message wasn't from him. It was from an unknown number, cryptic and terrifying, Mark Harrison. ICU, St. Jude's Hospital, Milwaukee. Acute myocardial infarction. Need immediate family. Milwaukee? That was 4 states away, nowhere near Chicago. My father, the foundation of our solid, picture-perfect family, the man who preached honesty and integrity, was lying broken in a city he never mentioned, nearly dead. My mother, Sarah, dissolved into hysterics immediately. She couldn't drive, couldn't think, only cry. I packed a single overnight bag, grabbed her credit card, and drove through the pre-dawn darkness, fueled by sheer panic and a sickening, cold curiosity. Why Milwaukee? Why was the emergency contact an automated hospital system instead of my mom? I kept telling myself it was a clerical error, a simple mistake in the chaos of a medical crisis. But deep down, a whisper started, a nasty, insistent sound that something was fundamentally wrong. My dad was meticulous. He didn't make mistakes. The closer I got to St. Jude's, the heavier the air felt, thick with unspoken secrets. I walked into the sterile, quiet nightmare of the ICU waiting room and gave the nurse my name. She looked at me, then looked down at her clipboard, confusion etched onto her face. Are you Miss Harrison? We already have Mrs. Harrison here. She arrived an hour ago. I froze. Mrs. Harrison? My mother was 700 miles away, crippled by fear. The pit in my stomach expanded, threatening to consume me whole. I looked across the quiet room, and that's when I saw her. A petite woman with tired, red-rimmed eyes, clutching my father's familiar leather briefcase. She looked up, and our eyes locked. We were strangers, yet we shared the same frantic sorrow. But only one of us could truly belong here. I walked slowly toward the woman, the floor tiles suddenly feeling like quicksand beneath my feet. She stood up, her face pale but composed, a look of strained worry that mirrored my own. She was about my mother's age, maybe slightly younger, and impeccably dressed, clearly having rushed straight from a meeting or an office. I'm Lana Harrison, I managed, my voice sounding shaky and unfamiliar. I'm his daughter. She blinked, a slow, deliberate movement, and then the composure cracked. A flash of utter bewilderment, followed immediately by fierce suspicion, crossed her face. His daughter? She echoed, her voice a low, throaty whisper. That's impossible. Mark only has 2 children, James and Chloe. And I'm his wife, Eliza. The world tilted. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room seemed to dim, focusing all the harsh light onto her claim. Wife. Eliza. The name on the clipboard suddenly made agonizing sense. This was the Mrs. Harrison the nurse had mentioned. For 20 years, my father had been leaving our home for business trips, and for 20 years, he had been living another life, married to another woman. The realization was a physical blow. I swayed, grabbing the back of a nearby chair for support. You're lying, I hissed, the panic morphing into immediate, visceral rage. My parents have been married for 35 years. You must be mistaken. You're maybe a colleague, a friend, she cut me off, her own anger now boiling over, fueled by her own terror and confusion. She opened the briefcase she was holding, pulled out a stack of documents, and slammed them onto the small plastic table. The top one was a marriage certificate. Mark Harrison and Eliza Hawthorne. Dated 20 years ago, almost to the day. 20 years. Half my life. He hadn't just cheated, he had built an entire parallel universe. The confrontation that followed was hushed but explosive, two women tearing apart the man they loved while he lay fighting for his life 50 feet away. Eliza showed me photos, holiday snaps, anniversary dinners, graduation ceremonies for James and Chloe, who looked eerily like younger versions of my father. They weren't just sporadic rendezvous, they were a complete, detailed life. She explained that Mark always traveled home to see his aging parents, my grandparents, who had passed away years ago. I realized with a sickening jolt, and she accepted it as part of his high-pressure job. He maintained separate residences but always returned to her in Milwaukee. The complexity, the sheer, meticulous effort required to sustain this deception for 2 decades was mind-boggling. It wasn't just a lie, it was architecture. I called my mother, stepping out into the sterile hallway, trying to keep my voice steady. The moment I told her, "Mom, Dad has another wife," the line went dead. The silence was louder than any scream. When she finally called back, her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like an empty shell. She just said 2 words, "the apartment." I didn't understand. She told me to go to an address she gave me in downtown Milwaukee, an address I recognized immediately as the location of the business associate's office Dad supposedly frequented. "It's a condo," she whispered. "He bought it years ago. Go there. Find the safe." I always knew he was hiding money. I didn't know he was hiding a life. My mother, the supposedly naive victim, had her own secret suspicion, a gnawing doubt she had suppressed for years, focusing only on the financial betrayal, not the emotional one. But her instruction, the sudden, focused demand, told me she was shifting instantly from grieving wife to cold, calculating avenger. I left Eliza at the hospital, both of us numb, sharing a mutual, devastating enemy who was currently hooked up to life support. The condo address led me to a high-end luxury building. Dad owned this. Of course, he did. He needed a neutral meeting ground, a place where neither family's scent could cling to him. I used the key Mom had surprisingly produced, a duplicate she must have found years ago and kept hidden, a contingency plan for a disaster she hoped would never arrive. The apartment was impersonal, decorated in sterile grays and whites, like a high-class hotel suite. No photos, no personal touches, just expensive art and furniture. It smelled faintly of old leather and anxiety. I found the safe hidden behind a ridiculously large painting in the study, just where Mom said it would be. Inside, it wasn't just money. There were bonds, offshore account details, and a small, brittle stack of letters tied with a piece of faded blue ribbon. I pulled out the letters, recognizing my father's neat, sloping handwriting immediately. They were correspondence dating back 25 years, addressed to a woman named C in New York. These weren't love letters, they were business communications. Except they mentioned specific dates, specific transactions, and a recurring phrase, protecting the principal assets. I realized with a chill that the double marriage might just be the tip of the iceberg. Dad wasn't just a bigamist, he was orchestrating something much larger, something that involved hidden financial structures and maybe even more people than just Eliza. The letter spoke of succession planning and how he needed to ensure both claims were legally ironclad, ensuring he maintained control over a massive, secret trust fund I never knew existed. I sat on the cold marble floor of the sterile condo, sifting through the evidence, the reality of my father shrinking from a larger-than-life hero into a pathetic, calculating villain. The man I loved and respected was a professional liar, a master of deception who had built a foundation of sand for both families. The financial documents confirmed that the trust fund, established by my paternal grandfather, was locked in such a way that if Mark was ever found guilty of fraud or moral turpitude, the entire estate would revert to the legal bloodline, specifically naming me and my mother. However, the documentation also showed a separate, smaller trust established for Eliza and her children, contingent on Mark's marital status at the time of his death. He had pitted us against each other, even in death, trying to maintain total control. This wasn't love, this was a strategic game of ownership and asset protection, using human relationships as shields. I looked at the faded ribbon tying the old letters together, feeling an emptiness that went bone deep. How do you reconcile the man you worshipped with the monster who built his happiness on 2 decades of lies? Tell me, what would you do if you realized your entire childhood was a stage production designed purely to protect a financial legacy? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I knew I couldn't face my mother, or Eliza, or even my silent, cheating father without knowing the full truth contained in those sealed letters. I carefully untied the ribbon, my hands trembling. The first letter, dated 1998, was brief, brutal, and addressed to an attorney. It confirmed that he had intentionally registered the marriage to Eliza under a slightly altered name in a different state, believing it would complicate any future divorce proceedings with my mother, thereby protecting the original family trust. He used Eliza as a tool, a legal decoy, long before she even knew it. The more I read, the clearer the betrayal became. Mark wasn't just hiding a wife, he was hiding a massive, complex lie about the entire structure of his wealth. The trust that was supposed to go to my mother and me was being systematically drained and funneled into these separate accounts, all carefully labeled as investment acquisitions managed by the same attorney mentioned in the letters. The attorney, C, turned out to be my father's sister, Carol, whom he had always claimed was estranged and living overseas. The family rift? Another lie. They were working together, covering the paper trail, ensuring that if anything happened to Mark, my mother would be left with virtually nothing, and Eliza would inherit the shell of the secondary fund. The man who lectured me on moral accountability every single Sunday was the biggest fraud I had ever encountered. My blood was boiling, but a strange, cold calm settled over me. I realized that my father's near-death experience wasn't a tragedy, it was a window of opportunity. I had the keys to both families, the truth, and the evidence needed to completely dismantle the elaborate facade he had constructed. I returned to the hospital, not as the confused, grieving daughter, but as the executioner. Eliza was still there, sitting exactly where I had left her hours earlier, staring blankly at the wall. I sat beside her and gently placed the marriage certificate from the safe on her lap, alongside the evidence of the drained trust funds. Eliza picked up the documents, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her eyes racing over the legal jargon and the stark figures. The realization hit her even harder than it hit me. Her shock wasn't just about the first wife, it was about the utter lack of true financial commitment from Mark to her family. He hadn't been providing for her, he had been protecting himself. He had promised her security, and the papers showed he had built a weak, hollow structure that would collapse the moment he stopped managing it. The secondary trust was almost empty. The color drained from her face. He told me he was divorced, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He said his first marriage ended before he met me. That he kept in contact for the sake of his aging mother. Her grief was pure, unadulterated devastation. We were two victims united by a shared, colossal lie. The hatred I felt for my father suddenly overshadowed the conflict between us. We didn't need to fight over Mark, we needed to destroy him, together. We went back to the ICU room. The nurse informed us that Mark had been stabilized and was now conscious, though still heavily sedated and unable to speak clearly. This was the moment. We walked into his room. The sight of him, pale and weak, strapped to machines, did nothing to diminish my rage. He looked up, his eyes unfocused, then widened slightly as he saw both of us standing there, shoulder to shoulder, the embodiment of his failed deceit. Eliza spoke first, her voice steelier than I ever would have expected from the broken woman I met yesterday. Mark, the trusts are empty. Lana and I know everything. The condo, the letters, Carol. It's all over. She held up the documents, waving them slightly so he could see the damning evidence. Mark tried to speak, making a painful, choked noise, a sound of pure panic trapped in a failing body. He strained against the restraints, his eyes begging, pleading, trying to form words that wouldn't come. The sight of his fear gave me a perverse satisfaction. He needed to understand the depth of the chaos he created. You played a game of chess with our lives, Dad, I said, leaning close so my voice was the only thing he could hear over the beeping monitors. 20 years of secrets. You used us both, not as wives and daughters, but as financial pawns. But you forgot one thing, pawns can sometimes turn into queens, especially when they work together. I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording I had secretly made of Eliza explaining his convoluted divorce lie. The raw despair in her voice filled the silent room. Mark's eyes rolled back slightly, his blood pressure monitor spiking violently. The nurses rushed in immediately, yelling at us to leave. But the message had landed. He knew we were united, and he knew he had lost everything that mattered. Over the next few days, while Mark remained incapacitated, Eliza and I worked methodically. We hired the same ruthless divorce attorney, not to separate from Mark, though that was certainly happening, but to launch a massive fraud investigation into the trust fund and the accounts he had moved offshore with my Aunt Carol. We found that Carol had already fled the country, a clear indication of their guilt. My mother, Sarah, arrived in Milwaukee the next day, not to weep at her husband's bedside, but to meet Eliza and strategize. It was one of the strangest, yet most empowering, meetings of my life. The woman who should have been Mom's sworn enemy became her closest ally. Sarah hadn't forgiven Mark, but she instantly recognized Eliza's equal suffering and the powerful opportunity for retribution. They were surprisingly effective, two women who had been manipulated by the same charming monster, now using his own meticulous planning against him. The attorney determined that because Mark intentionally misled both wives regarding his marital status and misused the trust for personal gain outside its legal parameters, both marriages could be annulled under fraud, simplifying the legal division but utterly destroying Mark's reputation and financial holdings. The karmic debt was accumulating rapidly. The hospital discharged Mark and transferred him to a rehab facility, the stroke having left him partially paralyzed and unable to manage his elaborate deceit any longer. He was physically and financially broken, completely alone, unable to sweet talk or scheme his way out of the disaster. The final blow came 2 weeks later. The full fraud investigation was launched publicly, citing the bigamy and the intentional manipulation of generational wealth. Mark Harrison, the pillar of business integrity, became Mark Harrison, the national scandal. The financial ruin was instant and absolute. The original trust, protected by the strict clauses Mark himself had written, reverted entirely to my mother and me, compensating us for the years of deceit. Eliza received a settlement that guaranteed her children's futures, secured not by Mark's empty promises, but by our collective legal victory against him. I saw Mark one last time, during a procedural court hearing held remotely at the rehab center. He was frail, defeated, and surrounded only by his court-appointed attorney. He tried to meet my eye, but I looked straight through him. The man I knew was gone, replaced by a ghost of deception. We won, financially and morally. Eliza and my mother decided to maintain a cautious friendship, bonded by their shared trauma and their ultimate triumph. My life was shattered, yes, but rebuilt on a far stronger, truthful foundation. The pain remains, but so does the deep satisfaction of seeing a man who valued assets over humanity lose absolutely everything. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this, please subscribe to the channel Dramatic Zone, leave a like, and write in the comments which country you are from. Stay tuned, there will be a new story tomorrow.